So, power rankings for week 13 of Super Rugby. After crunching all the numbers, the story of this week is probably static. There's not a whole lot of movement on the board, but I'll give you a look, and you guys can let me know your thoughts once we're all done. In 15th, one win, although it was impressive. It's not quite enough to bump the Sunwolves off 15th spot. There's still a couple of wins behind the teams ahead of them, but hey man, if they can keep putting in performances like that, you do never know. With other teams ahead of them also losing, it kind of closes the gap, but still realistically, with a record of 1-9-0, they are easily the worst team in the competition, although that was still a pretty bright spot last week. So hey, it's not all doom and gloom for the Sunwolves. Next, in 14th, and man, it sucks for them to be in the New Zealand Conference because they just get beaten with regularity. The Blues got a pretty decent score put on them by the Hurricanes on the weekend at home. So it kind of it keeps on going. 3 wins, 8 losses. I mean, they're 12th on the table, but yeah, it's a pretty poor record the Blues have got. Yeah, nothing much more to say. Perhaps if they were in a different conference, they'd be performing better. But as it is, they're with all the good New Zealand teams, and they are suffering because of it. Next, in 13th, and only very, very marginally ahead of the Blues, are the Brumbies. The Brumbies equally are looking pretty poor this year. It's not been a great season. 3 wins, 7 losses. And that's in, based on the standings, it's the weakest of the 3 conferences, and they can't pick up much in that conference. So, yeah, it's not going well for the Brumbies. Hopefully next year's going to be better at this point. They're 14th on the table, so yeah, it's not pretty reading. Next, and despite their position, there's still, I think, more optimism around the Reds. They're still the same, no change from last week. 4 wins, 6 losses. Although a pretty bad one against the Sunwolves in Tokyo. They just didn't show up, and they've got a knack of just not showing up in some games this year. So if they can manage to get some consistency in their game, they may be a threat going forward, but it still looks to be a pretty long-term project at this stage. Next, the Rebels. They picked up a win over the weekend, but they still stick in 11th spot. Not quite enough to close the gap on teams ahead of them. There is probably a bit of a gap between the Rebels and then the teams below them. But the Rebels didn't exactly set the world alight with a couple points win over the Brumbies, 3-point win over the Brumbies. So I mean, I guess it was away from home, so we'll give them credit there. But it's not like they took down one of the big boys. It was the lowly Brumbies. So good for them to get a win. But yeah, nothing really much to get so excited about there. Next, in 10th, these guys do actually move for a change. The Sharks are down 1 spot into 10th. 4-6-1 record, so 4 wins, 6 losses and a draw. Yeah, it wasn't one of these performances where the Sharks didn't show up this week, but it's another loss. It was a confidence loss as well, which makes it a kind of especially bitter pill to swallow. It's really hard for people to make traction in that conference, and yeah, they're suffering because of it. Next, in 9th, and yeah, disappointing for the Stormers. Their record moves to 5 wins, 7 losses. I mentioned in the review that the road to the playoffs for them is looking exceptionally long now. It's an uphill battle, but yeah, they're in a similar position to a lot of the other teams in the South African Conference, that they just need to put a string of wins together, and you do never know, but it's going to be tricky, that's for sure. Next, up 2, pretty much jumping these 2 teams below them who drop 1 each, are the Bulls. So the Bulls, their record was starting to look a bit shady with 2 losses in a row prior to this week, but their win over the Sharks brings them back to kind of 5-6-0, so just one win off kind of being even. So that's good. It's still a building team kind of going through a rebuild similar to what we're seeing with some other teams like the Reds. But they seem to be doing it kind of at a slightly higher level. So in a tougher conference, they're still getting some decent results. And yeah, I think there's still lots to look forward to. Playoffs, again, if they can put some runs together, I don't see why not. Currently, they are 9th, so just out of the playoffs. Next, they had the bye, so the Jaguares stick with 7th. Teams below them didn't quite do enough to jump them, and teams above them didn't quite do enough to drop. So they stick with 7th, but it'll be one to watch. They seem to be a team to watch at the moment because they're on one of the best kind of winning streaks outside the New Zealand Conference, top 2 teams. Next, Waratahs. Fortunate to remain the same, to be fair. A loss, but it's really hard to punish the Waratahs too much for being away from home against a strong team in the Crusaders and losing by only a couple points. So it's almost like remaining static. If they'd gone and gotten beaten by 30 or 20, even for kind of maybe 15 points, I probably would have had the Jaguares skip them, but it was an impressive loss if there is kind of such a thing. Next, the Lions, not quite as an impressive loss. Their loss against the Highlanders, their record is now 6-6, so dead even. Still top of the South African Conference, but they'll need to start winning once they get back home because, yeah, that gap between them and the teams below them is not that much anymore. Next, 4th is the Chiefs. Chiefs managed to get a win, although it was ugly. It was away from home. It wasn't by a whole lot, but a win's a win. So they're definitely showing their hand as a playoff contender, but probably not at the same level as the top 2 teams at the moment anyway. A lot of injuries still affecting that squad, but we saw some guys coming back in this last game. So going forward, we'll see if they're able to kind of boost them up just to that kind of top level. Next, the Highlanders still remain at 3. So, yeah, it was a good win at home against a fairly tough Lions team, even if they are kind of slightly out of form at the moment. They had to travel back from South Africa and they had to do the job. They did it. They did enough to get a pretty comfortable win in the end. And, yeah, it sees them stay in 3rd spot. In 2nd, the Crusaders have been here for a while now. So 9 wins, 2 losses, even though they've had a couple of stuttering runs recently against some Aussie teams. They're still getting the results when they need to. You got to think that it's going to go on for a while yet. After last week's result with the Blues, you can't see the Blues upsetting them for this coming round. But stranger things have happened with that rivalry, but it's looking pretty unlikely at this point. And lastly, still number 1. Undefeated since that first week where they played in round 2. 9 wins, just the 1 loss. They're in 4th on the table, but they've still got a game in hand on the Crusaders. So you got to think that they'll be looking to pip them for that number 1 spot in New Zealand. Yeah, I mean, right now, just looking at everybody's standings, I mean, the predicted final would surely be Hurricanes Crusaders, but I mean, it only takes 1 or 2 games to kind of change the look of things. At the start of the comp, it was looking for all money like Lions Crusaders, but yeah, a few drop games and then the kind of whole picture shifts. So we'll see what happens. The kind of current predictions are only as good as the most recent round, so there's still lots of rugby to be played. And you never know what effect the June internationals are going to have, because no doubt there'll be injuries, so it'll just kind of be luck of the draw to see who comes out of those tests with the least damage. What do you guys think? Like I said, pretty static. Only 3 teams on the move. The top teams all won, so there's nothing really much doing there. 5 and 6 had a loss. 7 was on a bye. These teams shuffled, and apart from the Rebels and the Sunwolves, these guys all had losses. So Sunwolves are too far behind to catch up, and the Rebels are kind of just starting to get themselves back into that mid-table picture. All right, guys. Yeah, that's it from me. And yeah, talk to you again soon. See ya.